Retired after 60, 10 Stoic secrets for a peaceful and lasting relationship. There is a moment that happens in almost every long marriage, and almost nobody talks about it. It happens the week after the retirement party ends. The gold watch is on the shelf. The cake is finished. The co-workers have stopped calling. And two people who spent 30, 40, sometimes 50 years mostly seeing each other in the evenings are suddenly together all day, every day, for the rest of their lives. Some couples find this to be the most beautiful chapter of their story. Others find that the silence in the room is louder than any argument they ever had. The difference between these two outcomes is almost never luck. It is not really about how much money is in the retirement account, or how healthy either person is, or even how much they loved each other in their 30s. The difference comes down to something far older than modern marriage counseling. It comes down to a set of ideas developed 2,000 years ago by men who buried children, who were exiled from their homes, who watched empires rise and collapse, and who still found a way to write, calmly, about how to live well with another human being until the very end. Stay with me for the next half hour, because by the end of this video, you will understand 10 Stoic secrets that can transform a retirement that feels like drifting apart into a retirement that feels like coming home. And I promise you, secret number 7 is the one that most couples never figure out until it's almost too late. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for those seeking timeless wisdom to build a life of purpose, virtue, and inner peace. Our channel is dedicated to helping you apply the ancient philosophy of Stoicism to modern life, drawing on the teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, and the great Stoic thinkers who came before us. Ancient wisdom for the modern mind. If you are new here, consider hitting that subscribe button, because we release videos just like this one designed to help you live with more clarity, more resilience, and more peace, no matter what season of life you find yourself in. Now let's begin. Let me introduce you to 3 people, because their stories are going to walk beside us through every secret in this video. Eleanor is 63. She spent 31 years teaching high school chemistry, and 11 months ago she retired. Her husband, a quiet man named Robert, retired 2 years before her from his job as an electrician. For the first 10 months, Elena thought retirement would feel like the vacation she used to dream about during grading season. Instead, she found herself sitting across the breakfast table from a man she suddenly wasn't sure she knew anymore, not because he had changed, but because for 30 years their relationship had been built around brief windows of time. Dinners, weekends, the rhythm of a school calendar. Now there was no calendar. There was only time, an enormous, unstructured ocean of it, and neither of them had a map. James is 67. He is a widower who remarried 4 years ago to a woman named Carol, also in her 60s. Their story is one of second chances. But James will be the first to tell you that a second marriage in your 60s comes with its own particular weight. Old grief that surfaces at unexpected moments. Grown children who are still adjusting a different rhythm than the one either of them knew in their first marriages. James found in Stoicism something he did not expect. Not a way to suppress his grief for his first wife, but a way to hold it honestly while still building something real with Carol. And then there is Marco. Marco is 71, married to Angela for 44 years. Of the 3, Marco and Angela have weathered the most storms. 2 recessions, a house fire, the loss of a son, and yet Marco insists, with a kind of stubborn conviction, that the last decade of his marriage, the retirement decade, has been the best one. Not because life got easier, it didn't, but because somewhere along the way, Marco learned to apply an old philosophy to a very new kind of togetherness. These 3 stories are going to return throughout this video, because Stoicism was never meant to be an abstract exercise. It was meant to be lived, in kitchens, in arguments, in long silences on a porch. So let's begin with the very first secret, one that Epictetus himself built his entire philosophy around. Secret number 1, master the dichotomy of control. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a former slave named Epictetus opened his teachings with a single radical idea. Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us. Our judgments, our desires, our reactions, these are up to us. Our partner's moods, their past, their health, their habits formed over 60 years, these are not up to us. This sounds simple. It is not simple to live. When Elena's husband Robert retired, he brought home a particular habit that drove her quietly insane. He would sit in his recliner from 4 in the afternoon until dinner, watching the news, saying almost nothing. For 30 years, Elena had only witnessed this behavior in small doses, an hour here, an evening there. Now it filled entire afternoons, and she began to resent it deeply. She found herself trying again and again to fix it. She would suggest hobbies. She would drop hints about volunteering. She would sigh loudly while walking past the television. None of it worked, and worse, it made her miserable, because she was pouring her energy into something entirely outside her control. Another adult human being's temperament, formed over 67 years of life. It was her daughter, oddly enough, who first mentioned Stoicism to her after finding one of our videos. Elena read Epictetus for the first time that winter, and one particular line stopped her cold. He wrote that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. Robert sitting in a recliner was simply an event. Her suffering came entirely from her judgment that this event meant something was wrong, that it meant he didn't love her enough to change, that it meant their retirement was failing. She began slowly to separate the two. Robert's recliner habit, not up to her. Her own reaction, her own choice about how to spend her afternoons. Whether to sit with him in comfortable silence, read her own book nearby, or go for a walk alone, entirely up to her. The moment she stopped trying to control Robert's temperament and started taking full ownership of her own afternoons, something shifted. The resentment didn't vanish overnight, but the daily friction dropped dramatically, because she was no longer fighting a battle she could never win. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote something similar to himself in his private journal, the collection we now call Meditations. He reminded himself again and again that other people's actions are not his to command. Only his own mind is truly his own. If an emperor who commanded legions had to remind himself daily that he could not control other people, what chance do the rest of us have without practicing the same discipline? Here is a practical way to apply this today, in your own relationship, regardless of your age. Take one recurring source of friction, something small, a habit, a tone of voice, a way of loading the dishwasher. Ask yourself honestly, is this actually within my control to change? If it is not, your task is not to fix your partner. Your task is to master your own judgment about it. This single shift, more than any other piece of advice in this video, has the power to quiet decades of low-grade marital tension. Now, before we move to secret number 2, I want to ask you something. Think of one thing about your partner or about someone you love that you have been quietly trying to change for years without success. Type it in the comments below, just a word or two if you'd rather keep it private. I read every comment, and I promise you, you are far from alone. Secret number 2, practice negative visualization before it's too late to matter. The Stoics had a peculiar practice that sounds on the surface almost morbid. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Seneca recommended imagining in advance the loss of the things and people we love. Not to become pessimistic, not to live in fear, but to strip away the fog of familiarity that makes us take our closest relationships for granted. James understood this practice more intimately than most, because he had lived through the actual loss, not the imagined one. His first wife, Diane, passed away after 38 years of marriage. He describes the months after her death as a kind of philosophical awakening he never wanted, but received anyway. He realized with brutal clarity how many ordinary Tuesday evenings he had spent distracted, irritated over nothing, wishing the evening would just move faster so he could go to sleep. He had wasted, by his own estimate, thousands of hours of a finite, precious thing, simply because he assumed there would always be more of it. When James remarried Carol 4 years ago, he carried this lesson with him like a compass. He does not perform negative visualization out of anxiety. He performs it as a discipline, the same way an athlete stretches before a competition. Some mornings, before Carol wakes up, he will sit quietly with his coffee and simply consider, without spiraling, that this morning is not guaranteed, that the sound of her moving around in the next room is not a background noise to be tuned out, but a gift he once lost and is now, improbably, receiving again. Marcus Aurelius wrote a passage in Meditations that has become one of the most quoted lines in all of Stoic literature. He advised himself each morning to say to his wife or his child as he kissed them that this could be the last time, not to induce despair but to prevent the small, silent tragedy of loving someone carelessly simply because they are still here. For couples in their 60s and 70s, this practice carries a weight that younger couples simply cannot access in the same way. Death is no longer an abstract concept discussed at funerals for distant relatives. It is a realistic horizon, sometimes decades away, sometimes not. Rather than avoiding this truth, the Stoics ask us to look directly at it and let that clarity transform the way we treat the person across the table from us tonight. Try this exercise this evening. Before bed, spend 60 seconds imagining, honestly and without flinching, a day without your partner in it. Then open your eyes, look at them, really look, and notice how the ordinary moment of them brushing their teeth or turning off a lamp suddenly feels different. This is not about fear. This is about presence. Secret number 3. Let go of the story that you are owed anything. One of the most quietly destructive beliefs in long relationships is the sense of being owed something. I did this for you for 30 years, so you owe me that. I sacrificed my career, so you owe me this. I supported you through your worst decade, so you owe me gratitude, attention, deference. Marco understands this trap because he lived inside it for nearly a decade of his marriage. In his 50s, during what he now calls his angriest years, Marco kept a mental ledger with Angela. Every sacrifice he made was logged. Every time she seemed to fall short of matching his effort, resentment quietly accumulated. Like interest on an unpaid debt neither of them had agreed to. It was Epictetus again who offered Marco a way out, through a teaching that initially struck him as harsh. Epictetus taught that we should treat our relationships, even our marriages, the way we treat a dinner party. If a dish is passed to you, take your fair portion and let it move on. Do not grab, do not demand more than what is offered, and do not resent the host for not giving you everything you believe you deserve. Applied to marriage, this teaching does not mean tolerating mistreatment or abandoning healthy boundaries. It means releasing the exhausting, silent accounting system so many long-term couples run in the backgrounds of their minds. Marco describes the shift like this. For years he measured his marriage by what he was owed. Somewhere around his 63rd birthday, he began instead measuring it by what he was given freely, imperfectly, by an imperfect woman who was also doing her best. This reframe changed something concrete in his daily behavior. He stopped keeping score of who did the dishes more often. He stopped mentally cataloging Angela's forgotten promises from decades earlier and bringing them up during arguments about entirely unrelated topics. The ledger, once closed, stopped generating new debts to resent. If you find yourself in an argument with your partner and a decade-old grievance suddenly surfaces, that is often a sign the ledger is still open. Consider today closing one entry in it. Not because your partner necessarily deserves forgiveness in some cosmic sense, but because you deserve to be free of carrying it. Secret number 4. Your partner's flaws are not obstacles to your peace. They are the material for your virtue. This next teaching comes directly from Marcus Aurelius, and it may be the single most transformative reframe in all of Stoic philosophy applied to relationships. In Meditations, Marcus repeatedly reminds himself that he will encounter difficult, ungrateful, arrogant, and dishonest people throughout his day. And rather than being surprised or outraged by this, he should expect it. and use these encounters as opportunities to practice patience, understanding, and self-control. Elena found this teaching almost offensive the first time she encountered it. Robert's habit of interrupting her mid-sentence, something he had done for 3 decades, was not, she felt, an opportunity for her personal growth. It was simply annoying. But she kept reading, and she encountered a deeper layer of the idea. The Stoics were not asking her to pretend the interruption was good. They were asking her to notice that the interruption itself was neutral, an external event, and what mattered was the virtue she chose to bring to her response. Here is the practical shift. Instead of viewing Robert's flaw as an obstacle standing between her and a peaceful retirement, she began viewing it as the actual terrain on which her peace would be built. A calm sea, the Stoics remind us, never made a skilled sailor. If Robert had been a perfectly patient listener for 40 years, Elena would never have had the opportunity to develop the patience she now possesses. Patience that, incidentally, has made her a calmer grandmother, a more understanding friend, a steadier presence in every part of her life. This does not mean tolerating genuine mistreatment. Stoicism was never a philosophy of doormats. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire. He was not passive, but there is a profound difference between addressing a boundary that has been crossed and being perpetually outraged by the ordinary, forgivable imperfections of the person you chose to spend your life with. Nobody arrives at 60 or 70 without flaws, sanded into their personality by decades of living. The question Stoicism asks is not, how do I eliminate my partner's flaws, but what kind of person do I become in the presence of them? Try naming, honestly, one flaw in your partner that has irritated you for years. Now ask, what virtue could I specifically practice the next time it happens, instead of my usual reaction? Patience, humor, simple silence. Write it down if it helps. The flaw isn't going anywhere, but your response to it is entirely, completely yours to shape. Before we continue to secret number 5, I want to remind you, if this video is resonating with you, a simple thumbs up genuinely helps this message reach other couples navigating this exact season of life. And if you know someone who just retired, or is about to, consider sending this video their way. Sometimes the right words at the right moment change an entire decade. Secret number 5, speak less and mean more of what you say. The Stoics placed enormous value on disciplined speech. Epictetus taught his students that nature gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we might listen twice as much as we speak. This teaching becomes especially critical in retirement, when couples suddenly find themselves in each other's company for hours that used to belong to co-workers, commutes, and separate errands. Carol, James's wife, made an observation early in their marriage that James still thinks about often. She told him that in her first marriage, which ended in divorce, she and her former husband had talked constantly, and yet somehow said almost nothing of substance for years. Conversation had become filler, a way to occupy silence, rather than a way to truly connect. James, drawing on his study of Stoicism, suggested something unconventional to Carol during their 2nd year of marriage. What if, instead of narrating every passing thought throughout the day, they practiced a kind of intentional restraint, saving their words for what actually mattered? Not coldness, not withdrawal, but a deliberate honoring of speech, the way you might save a good bottle of wine for an occasion worth marking. This does not mean silence for its own sake. It means noticing the difference between speaking to fill space and speaking to genuinely connect. Marcus Aurelius warned against becoming, in his words, a person whose words have grown cheap through overuse. In a long retirement, where the hours are abundant and the temptation to narrate every small frustration is constant, this discipline becomes a genuine act of respect toward your partner. Not every irritation needs to be voiced. Not every opinion needs to be shared in the moment it occurs. Some thoughts, examined honestly, reveal themselves to be passing weather, not permanent truths worth speaking aloud. James and Carol now have what they jokingly call a 24-hour rule for minor grievances. If something bothers one of them, and it is genuinely small, they wait a day before mentioning it. More often than not, the irritation dissolves on its own, revealed as the passing cloud it always was. What remains, the grievances that survive the 24 hours, those are worth discussing honestly and directly. This single practice has dramatically reduced the daily friction in their home, while somehow deepening rather than diminishing their actual conversations. Secret number 6. Amor fati, love your fate, including the fate of growing old together. There is a Stoic concept, most closely associated with the philosophy's later interpreters, known as amor fati, the love of one's fate. It does not mean passive resignation. It means the active, deliberate choice to embrace what has happened and what is happening, rather than constantly wishing for a different reality. Marco's understanding of this idea was forged in fire, quite literally. 14 years ago, Marco and Angela lost a significant portion of their home to an electrical fire. In the aftermath, Marco noticed two very different reactions available to him. He could spend his remaining years mourning the version of retirement he had once imagined, the one without insurance paperwork and temporary housing and the slow, expensive rebuild of a family home. Or he could accept fully and without bitterness that this was now simply his story, and ask what a good life looked like from this particular starting point, rather than the one he had originally planned. He chose the second path, and he describes it as one of the defining decisions of his life. Not because the fire was good. It wasn't. Stoicism does not ask us to pretend hardship is secretly wonderful. But amor fati asks us to stop wasting our limited energy fighting the unchangeable past, and instead direct all of that energy toward building well with what remains. Applied to marriage in your 60s and beyond, amor fati means something specific and important. It means releasing the fantasy of the marriage you thought you would have by now, the one where retirement looks exactly like the brochures. Endless travel, effortless harmony, a partner who has become, magically, an entirely different person than the one you actually married. Instead, it means loving the actual marriage in front of you. The one with Robert's recliner, Habit and Angela's grief over her son and Carol's occasional silences when memories of her own past surface unexpectedly. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the universe loves nothing so much as to change what exists and to make new things in its likeness. Aging, retirement, the changing shape of a decades-long marriage, these are not aberrations from a well-lived life. They are simply what a well-lived life eventually looks like. Amor fati asks you to meet this stage not with resignation, but with a kind of fierce, deliberate love for exactly what is. Secret number 7. Build a shared discipline, because unstructured time is where relationships quietly erode. This is the secret I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the one most couples never discover until damage has already been done. And it is, in many ways, the most practically important secret in this entire list. Here is the uncomfortable truth about retirement that almost nobody warns you about. A career, for all its stress, provided something invisible and precious: structure, fixed hours, external demands, a rhythm that governed the day whether you liked it or not. When that structure disappears, couples are left facing an enormous, undifferentiated expanse of time, and without a plan, that time does not automatically fill itself with connection. More often it fills itself with parallel isolation. Two people in the same house, each quietly retreating into their own separate routines. Television, phone, garden, garage, until years pass and they realize they have become, in Elena's words, polite roommates rather than partners. The Stoics were fanatics about discipline, not in a harsh, punishing sense, but in the sense of deliberately structuring one's day around what actually matters. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling an empire, maintained a rigorous personal schedule, journaling every single morning, examining his conduct every single evening. This was not rigidity for its own sake. It was the recognition that a life without intentional structure drifts, and drifting rarely drifts toward virtue. Elena and Robert eventually solved their afternoon silence problem not by having a single dramatic conversation, but by building a small, shared discipline into their week. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the exact hours Robert used to disappear into his recliner, They now take a walk together, rain or shine, through the same park near their home. It is not a grand gesture. It is not therapy. It is simply structure deliberately chosen that guarantees connection will happen rather than hoping it will happen on its own. Marco and Angela built something similar decades ago, almost by accident, a Sunday morning ritual of making breakfast together while listening to the same radio program they've listened to for 30 years. What began as habit became, over time, a kind of sacred anchor point in their week, one that has survived house fires, health scares, and every other disruption life has thrown at them. The lesson here is direct and actionable. Do not assume connection will simply happen because you now have unlimited time together. Unlimited, unstructured time is, paradoxically, one of the greatest threats to a retirement marriage. Choose one small, repeatable ritual this week: a daily walk, a weekly meal you cook together, a nightly 10 minutes of simply talking without the television on, and treat it with the same seriousness the Stoics treated their morning journaling. Structure is not the enemy of spontaneous love. It is very often the container that makes spontaneous love possible. If you have a ritual like this in your own relationship, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. These stories help other viewers more than you might realize. And honestly, they help me too. Secret number 8. Practice the view from above. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about a mental exercise he called the view from above, imagining oneself rising far above the earth, looking down at cities, nations, entire continents, watching human conflicts shrink into insignificance from that vast distance. He used this exercise to gain perspective on the smallness of the daily irritations that felt so enormous up close. James applies a version of this practice whenever tension arises with Carol over one of the small but persistent challenges of blending two families later in life. Disagreements about how to handle holidays that now include children from 2 previous marriages, or moments when old grief resurfaces unexpectedly and creates distance between them. In the heat of these moments, James has trained himself to pause and mentally rise above the situation, imagining how this particular disagreement will look in 5 years, or from the vantage point of his own eventual death. A vantage point Stoicism encourages us to consider often, not morbidly but clarifying. From that elevated view, the argument about whose turn it is to host Thanksgiving suddenly shrinks. It does not disappear, and it does not become unimportant, but it becomes rightly sized. James describes this practice as being like adjusting the zoom on a camera. Up close, everything looks enormous and urgent. Zoomed out, you can see the whole landscape, and most disagreements reveal themselves as small hills in an otherwise vast and beautiful terrain. Try this the next time a disagreement arises in your own relationship. Before responding, take one slow breath and mentally zoom out. Picture your relationship not as this single moment, but as the entire sprawling, decades-long story it actually is. Ask yourself from that wider view, how much does this particular disagreement actually weigh? Often you will find the honest answer is far less than it feels like right now. Secret number 9. Practice voluntary discomfort together. This secret surprises most people because it seems at first glance to have nothing to do with relationships at all. The Stoics regularly practiced what they called voluntary discomfort, deliberately choosing cold showers, simple meals, plain clothing, even brief periods of poverty, not out of asceticism for its own sake, but to build resilience and to remind themselves that they could handle far more than comfort had led them to believe. Marco and Angela discovered an unexpected version of this practice in their own retirement. Several years ago, feeling that their days had become too easy, too padded with comfort, they began taking on small, shared physical challenges together, hiking trails slightly beyond their comfort level, cooking with a strict, self-imposed grocery budget for a month, just to remember what it felt like, sleeping one night a month without any modern amenities at a rustic cabin they rent nearby. The purpose was never suffering for its own sake, It was rebuilding a kind of shared resilience, the sense, so easily lost in comfortable retirement years, that they could face difficulty together and come out the other side intact. Marco explains it this way: for years, the biggest threats to his marriage came not from hardship. Hardship, oddly, had always brought him and Angela closer, but from comfort. Comfort, left unchecked, breeds complacency, and complacency breeds distance. This does not mean you need to take up cold showers or wilderness survival in your 70s. It means considering honestly whether your relationship has become entirely frictionless, entirely padded, entirely easy in a way that has quietly stopped generating the shared resilience that hardship, chosen or unchosen, tends to build. Consider taking on one small, shared challenge with your partner this month. Something slightly outside your comfort zone, done together. You may find, as Marco and Angela did, that struggling side by side, even voluntarily, creates a closeness that comfort alone never could. Secret number 10, remember daily that this is enough. We arrive now at the final secret, and in many ways, it is the quiet culmination of everything that came before it. The Stoics taught a concept sometimes translated as contentment, though the deeper meaning runs closer to sufficiency. The recognition that what you already have, examined honestly and without the distortion of comparison, is genuinely enough. Seneca wrote extensively about the poverty of the wealthy man who always believes he needs just a little more to finally be satisfied. This same trap catches retired couples constantly, though it wears a different disguise. It is the belief that the marriage would finally be enough. If only the health scares would stop. If only the grandchildren visited more often. If only retirement looked more like the vacation photos other couples post online. Elena describes a particular evening, roughly 8 months into practicing these Stoic principles, when this final teaching finally landed for her. She was sitting with Robert on their porch. No dramatic conversation happening, no grand romantic gesture, just two older people sitting quietly as the evening cooled. The same kind of ordinary evening they had shared hundreds of times before. And for the first time in a long while, instead of measuring this evening against some imagined, more exciting version of retirement, she simply noticed, this is enough. This particular man, this particular porch, this particular quiet. Enough. This is not resignation. This is not settling. It is the hard-won recognition, arrived at only after genuinely practicing the 9 secrets before it, that a good life and a good marriage were never about accumulating more excitement, more travel, more dramatic romance. They were about paying full, undivided attention to what is actually already here. Marcus Aurelius closed many of his private reflections with variations of this same idea, that the present moment, examined honestly, is really all any of us ever have, and that a life well spent is simply a series of present moments met with full attention and genuine gratitude. Applied to a decades-long marriage entering its final, often quietest chapters, this becomes perhaps the most important secret of all. Not the search for a better marriage somewhere else, in some imagined future, but the daily disciplined choice to see the marriage you already have, fully, honestly, and with grateful eyes. So let's bring these 10 secrets together, because Elena, James, and Marco's stories were never really separate stories. They were 3 versions of the same journey. The journey every couple eventually faces if they are fortunate enough to grow old together. Master what you can control and release what you cannot. Look honestly at loss, so you stop taking presents for granted. Close the ledger of what you believe you're owed. Let your partner's flaws become the training ground for your own virtue. Speak less and mean more. Love your actual fate, not the fantasy you once imagined. Build structure into unstructured days. Rise above the small disagreements to see the larger, more beautiful shape of your story. Choose shared discomfort over passive comfort. And finally, recognize again and again that what you already have is enough. Robert never became a different man. He still sits in his recliner some afternoons, and Elena has made her peace, genuine peace, not the resigned kind with that. Carol still carries the quiet echoes of James's grief, alongside her own history, and together they have built something honest rather than perfect. And Marco and Angela, 44 years in, still argue occasionally over small things, because they are human. And Stoicism was never a promise of a conflict-free life. It was always a set of tools for meeting a real life with all its imperfection, with steadiness, virtue, and love. If retirement has left you feeling more distant from your partner than you expected, I want you to know clearly and directly that this is not a sign your marriage has failed. It is simply a sign that you have entered a new terrain, one that requires new tools. The tools in this video are not new at all. They are 2,000 years old, tested by emperors and former slaves alike, and they are available to you starting today, in your own kitchen, on your own porch,